kinds of different incarnations. We've had him just do our straight presentation. We've had him do off to the onsen weekend, which was quite a successful event. And I know that we certainly enjoyed the time with Paul, and I hope he had a good time with us as well. And this is our first virtual event with Paul. And I'd like to thank him for taking the time to join us today. I'm not going to spend a long time introducing Paul. I think that pretty much everybody here knows who he is and what he has done for our craft. So I would just like to welcome Paul to JALT Sendai, our May event, and turn the floor over to him to get started with his presentation today.
Sure. Okay. Okay, so today I want to talk about morphological awareness, and part of the motivation for that is that Laurie Bauer and I, mainly Laurie, just published a book on morphology for, what did Laurie call it? Morphology for the language teaching profession. You can see he named it, not me. And it was really interesting looking at how morphology or word parts, the role that they play in language learning. And another motivation for it is that there's a lot of debate going on at the moment about lemmas and flemmas and word families and coverage studies and all of that. And so it's really good to take a little step back and look at how morphology is important for language learners. There's two sorts of ways in which a reader dealing with morphology can deal with it. One way is if you see a word, a complex word, say a word like education, then you simply might deal with that as a word, not as part of the word family of educate. So that is, you could store the meaning of education in your mind, and so that whenever you came across education as a word, you would just directly access the meaning of the word education. Another way in which morphology can play a part is that when you access a word like education, you could decompose it as you read it. And that is, you say, well, I know educate, and I know that TION signals a noun, and so that allows me to deal with education. And there's quite a lot of research with first language learners to show that some words are stored as a morphological whole, and some words are dealt with by morphological analysis when people just use the language receptively and also productively. There's quite an interesting piece of research about the role of frequency and the role of morphology. My general belief until about a week ago was that the more frequent words would be stored as morphological wholes, and the less frequent words would be dealt with by analysis when learners met those words. But there's an interesting piece of research I read by another New Zealander called Jen Hay, where she looked at whether it was actually the frequency of the word or the relative frequency between the word stem and the derived form. And her hypothesis was that if the derived form of a word is much more frequent than the stem form of the word, and education happens to be much more frequent than educate, then the derived form is simply stored as a morphological whole. It's just as if it was one word. This is for native speakers. But if the stem of the word is more frequent and much more frequent than the derived form, then that word is likely to be dealt with by analysis whenever the word is met. And she puts forward a fairly convincing argument with some evidence that it's the relative frequency of the stem and the word form and the derived form which really affects how they're stored, not just simply the overall frequency of the word. I think that these two routes are probably important for foreign language learners with advanced proficiency. And I have a feeling that with learners of lower proficiency, there will be a tendency to learn the word perhaps as a whole before getting into analysis. But anyway, we'll see as we go. Now, let's look at morphological awareness. So what is morphological awareness? So morphological awareness involves conscious knowledge of the following ideas. So these are simply, it's like phonological awareness in the sense that there's sort of conceptual leaps that you have to make in order to have morphological awareness. And the obvious first idea is that English and many other languages are made of meaningful parts, and these parts systematically contribute to the meaning of words. Now, not all languages have complex words like English and like, I guess, Japanese has. But for a learner of English, it's really important to know that many words do have parts, and that the meaning of the parts generally contributes to the meaning of the whole. So that's just a sort of concept that learners have to get to grips with. The second thing is that knowing the meaning of the parts can help us to understand the meanings of words and to learn new words. So I've separated out two important benefits of having morphological awareness here, and that is that if you know the meanings of word parts, then that can help you understand what a word means. But it's also a way of helping words stay in your memory, so that by breaking a word into parts, you're doing some analysis and therefore deep and thoughtful processing of the word, and this will help the word stick in your memory. And then the third idea is that, like other aspects of language, such as vocab, grammatical patterns, collocations, word parts differ in their frequency of occurrence. Now, an important additional part with word parts is that word parts also differ in productivity, that is, in the likelihood that new words will be made using these parts, so that's productivity. They differ in regularity of form and in regularity of meaning. And regularity of form and regularity of meaning is sometimes called transparency. And that is it easy to see the parts in the word? Is it easy to see how the parts relate to the meaning? And then the fourth thing, which is not usually included in morphological awareness for native speakers of the language, but I think it's important, it should be an important part, and that is that the word parts of English are affected by the history of the English language. I think when people learn English, it's quite useful to know a little bit about how the English language developed, about the influence of Latin through the church, the influence of French through the Norman invasion and other relationships with France and so on. And it's important to see that English is primarily a Germanic kind of language, which tends to use very short words rather than complex words, but this is overlain with a very large proportion of Latinate, French, and Greek complex words. So these are just general ideas, and I think that these are ideas that teachers should help their learners come to grips with, but they're just really sources of information. Now, if you want to develop morphological awareness as something which involves knowledge and activity in dealing with words, then I think there's about half a dozen things that learners need to do and that teachers need to help learners do. I think that learners of English as a foreign language should go through a fairly systematic program of learning the spoken and written forms and meanings of the most useful prefixes, suffixes, and stems. I think the research coming largely out of Japan, but also from Thailand, and show that many learners of English as a foreign language don't have very good knowledge of word parts, and particularly the derivational affixes. And I think that these knowing these word parts would be of great help to them in their learning and use of English. So I think that it's good to have a program which says, look, we're going to check how well learners know the various important word parts of English, and then do something about it so that learners can systematically learn them. I don't think it's actually a very big job to get on top of the most frequent word parts of English, because I think now we have a fairly good idea of which ones are the most useful ones to learn first, and all of the little problems and things which go along with the various affixes. So the second thing to learn is to be able to recognize the most frequent and useful prefixes and suffixes and stems when they occur in words. And this is not always straightforward. Even with the affixes, there are some spelling changes that occur. And there's not a lot of spelling changes, but there are some. And these can make recognizing the parts of words difficult. But I think it's a skill that learners need to develop, and that is they can look at a word and say, yes, there's something in there that I know, and then they can check to see if it really is something that they know. The third thing to learn is to see how the meanings of the parts of the word contribute to the meaning of the whole word. Now, this is really the strategy of using word parts as a vocabulary learning strategy, and that is being able to break a word into parts and see the parts, and then being able to express the meaning of the word through the meaning of the parts. So making a deliberate connection then between the whole word meaning and the meaning of the word parts. And when you look up a dictionary, you often don't get a meaning which actually contains the meaning of the parts. If you look up something like composition, you don't get an explanation which has the word with or together, meaning com, and the tion meaning noun, and the pos meaning put. These are not always made clear in the meaning which is given in a dictionary. So this idea then of practicing breaking words into parts and then relating the meaning of the parts to the meaning of the whole, I think is a very useful strategy to practice. It's not something you would spend enormous amounts of time on, but it's something that you'd do, once or twice a week, just briefly, for many weeks. Okay, the fourth thing. Learning to recognize word parts, even though there have been some changes to the forms of the parts occurring together. So that when you add some prefixes or some stems to words, then there are spelling changes which can sometimes occur because of the joining together of the parts. And the most difficult one, I think, is the prefix in, and that can take many forms such as IL and IR and IM, depending on the beginning of the stem that it's joined to. Am I still coming through loud and clear? Because I've got really heavy rain on the roof.
Yeah, no problem. We can't hear the rain at all.
You can't hear the rain? Oh, that's great. Well, I can hear little else except the rain. Okay. So then that's number 4, looking at how word parts and perhaps even stems change when they are joined together. Now, the 5th thing I've got on the list is the idea of word families. And that is that in English, words can be a member of a word family where the members have a common stem, and that stem shares a common meaning amongst the members of the family. And it's useful then to be able to recognize that a word isn't a word just by itself, but a word is a word which shares features with other closely related words sharing the same stem. Now we're going to look at the meaning, the reason for raising the importance of this, but I think it's quite an important thing to know. And then number 6, in terms of learning goals for learners, is learning the word part strategy for remembering complex words. And I've already mentioned that strategy, which is simply break the word into parts, make sure that you know the meaning of the parts, and then try to reword the meaning of the word so that it uses the meaning of the parts. So I think then these are 6 learning goals that teachers and learners should have to deal with English morphology. Okay, how does morphological awareness help vocabulary learning? Well, you know, I've got a very simplistic idea of vocabulary learning. I think there are basically 2 things which really matter in order for vocabulary to be learned. One of those things is repetition, and the other is quality of processing. That is, for each repetition, the depth at which that word is processed affects the quality of the processing of that word. And the more deeply and thoughtfully a word is processed, the more likely it is to be remembered. Now, morphological awareness increases the opportunity for repetition considerably, because it means that each occurrence of any family member can be a repetition for the whole word family. So if learners can see that there's a connection between educate and education, and educational and uneducated, and so on, then each time they meet a member of that family, then it's another repetition which is helping with the learning of that word family. So that there are mutual effects occurring through being aware of a word family. Now, being aware of word families also affects quality of processing, because we know that repetition helps learning, but we also know that varied repetition, that is, repetition which is different in some way from the previous occurrences of the word that have been met, these help learning even more, because they enrich knowledge of that word and increase the possible associations that are available to recall that word. And so when a learner meets the same word stem in different forms, that is, as different family members, or in different contexts, or with different collocates, then you get better opportunities for learning than you do with verbatim repetition. So you can see then that morphological awareness increases these 2 very important learning conditions of repetition. That is, if you can see that there are possible word family members that are related, and when you meet one, you can say, oh, that's probably connected to something I already know, then you've actually had a big boost in repetition. Now, each family member in the first 1,000 or 2,000 words of English each family contains around about 6 or more family members. So you can see then that the opportunities for repetition increase greatly if learners have some morphological awareness. And with the quality of processing, you can see that meeting the same form with a different stem will help learning of that word. One of my favorite examples of that from my largely unsuccessful learning of Japanese was when we had what was called a conversation salon. So twice a week we went off to Japanese classes at the Shiakusho and did some learning of Japanese, and and one day the teachers thought it'd be a great idea if they brought in quite a few native speakers of Japanese and had a little sort of a kind of party. They called it a conversation salon where we could move around and use our very limited Japanese with native speakers. Now, we'd got interested in sumo while in Japan, and so we'd watch quite a lot of sumo. And I actually had quite a rich sumo vocabulary. And I remember while I was at this conversation salon, we were having some cakes and things like that, and someone passed a plate to me and said, "Mawashite kudasai." And I almost fell over backwards because I understood what she said, even though I'd never met the word mawashite before. I hope it's correct. And because I knew what a mawashi was from Japanese. And that was my only family member for the, I guess what family it is, but and when I saw that same stem now being occurring in an imperative, and I then had to refigure my meaning of what muwashi actually meant. And it just didn't mean a piece of cloth that a sumo wrestler wears, but it's something which goes around the sumo wrestler. And so mawashite kudasai, pass it around, was something that really struck me as something which was a very non-verbatim and a very varied repetition of that particular word. Stuck in my memory to today. Okay. So, what word parts are worth learning? Laurie Bauer, who I think is one of the world's leading morphologists, he's published innumerable books on English morphology and morphology in general, came up with a list of levels, largely through the motivation of Paul Mira, because I'd remembered Paul Mira sort of complaining that everyone's making these word lists, but they can't agree about what should go into a word family when they make the word list. And it would be good if we had some sort of standard set of guidelines so that we could decide that. And I thought, well, what better person than Laurie to get to do this? And so I talked to him, and he was very open to the idea. He's now talking about redoing it, but I don't think he would change the actual levels and the content that much, but he'd probably give a lot more detail about the parts which are in the various levels. And anyway, the result was we came up with 7 different levels of affixes, and they were based upon criteria of frequency. And frequency didn't mean how often the word occurred. It meant how many different words does this affix occur in. So how many different word families, I suppose, does this affix occur in? And then another criterion was productivity. And so if you take an affix like L-I-K-E, meaning bird-like, my bird-like figure, then like is a very productive affix because we're still making words using like. Whereas other affixes are not so productive when it comes to creating new words. And then the other criteria were the regularity of form and regularity of meaning, and that is what sort of spelling changes occurred. So you might have commit, and when ION or TION is added to commit, it actually becomes commission, so the T's become S and so on. Then you have less regularity of form in that. And so what levels that the affixes went into still became a matter of personal judgment, but these criteria were used to guide that judgment. And so level 1, which is not there, is that every word form is a different word. So book is a different word from books, and run is a different word from running. Now level 2 is the level of inflections. And there's a small number of inflections in English, and they're listed there: the plural, third person, singular, present tense, past participle, stem plus ing, and then the comparative and the superlative and possessors. I'm told there are even morphologists who argue that there's some case for even adding ly to the as an inflection, but it doesn't meet several of the criteria needed for classification as an inflection. But inflected forms are really all that inflected forms do is they don't change the part of speech of the word, but they change agreement and things like that, the word. Now, level 2 now really needs to be subdivided, because I think at level 2 you can either have a lemma where all the members of the word family are the same part of speech, or you can have what Jeffrey Pinchbeck called the phlegma, where the members of the word family can be different parts of speech. And so at level 2, you could have the family of walk, and that could contain the verb walk and the noun walk, as in we went for a walk. And so therefore, as part of the family, you could have walk as a stem, walk plus plural s, I like going for walks. And then you have walk as a verb and walk plus s as third person s, and so on. Now, the phlegma is what the word lists that I work with can handle, simply because unless you have a tagged corpus, you can't really deal with lemmas that when you run text over corpora. But there's good arguments for the phlegma as a word family level. So in a way, level 2 could contain level 2 step 1 and level 2 step 2, and level 2 step 2 would be the phlegma. Okay, level 3 are amongst the most frequent and regular and productive affixes, derivational affixes. And these include able, ER, such as in teacher and singer and so on. I have actually been doing a little bit of work to look and see which derived forms are more frequent than their stem form. And I've now got some lists of that. I've got to do a little bit of more work on it. But in the first 1,000 words, it looks like there's probably somewhere around 20 to 25 words where the derived form of the word is more frequent than the stem plus inflected forms of the words. I think teacher might be one of those examples where teacher is actually more frequent than the lemma or phlegma of teach. And then you have ish, such as in greenish, and then use as in useless, and ly as in slowly, and ness as in slowless. The th at level 3 only applies to a very small number of words, and they're all numbers. So then if you have 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th, 12th, and so on, that th is included in level 3, and so that marks the regular ordinal numbers of English. So a very limited number of words, but in fact those words are very important words in English and very common. Then you have y, which makes adjectives, and then 2 prefixes, non and un, and it says all with restricted uses, because they create only certain parts of speech and so on. So in level 3, we've got, I think what's this, about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. We've got 10 affixes, which are not that difficult to learn, but which account for a fairly large proportion of the derivational affix use of English, and which are fairly regular, and most of them are reasonably productive as well. Level 4 adds another, I think it's another 10, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, or 11. Yeah, level 4 adds another level, another set of affixes and so on. So let's look at the next lot. Level 5 is a very large group. These are reasonably frequent in terms of frequency of occurrence, but then they have a fairly limited group of words that they can occur with. And you can see that once again that we have suffixes and prefixes in that list. And then level 6. In level 6, there are some very frequent prefixes. The prefix re is a very frequent prefix, and ION and ITON are very frequent, but they're also somewhat irregular, so that you often have changes to the stem form when these are added to words. And so even though they can be very common, there's a lot of it could be difficulties in recognizing them when they occur as parts of words, because there are other words beginning with re which don't have that particular meaning, and there are also the spelling difficulties with it. And then level 7, you're moving away, or I should say then, from level 2 to level 6, all of the derived forms are built on stems which can stand as words in their own right. So that means if we take our example of education again, then if we take away the TION of education and we're left with educate, then educate can be a word in its own right. But there are quite a few stems, such as, for example, spectacles, where the spect part means to see, and that can't stand as a word in its own right. It only exists as a part of a more complex word, and they're called bound forms. So level 2 to level 6 really deals with free forms, where the stems are free forms, but level 7 includes what Laurie calls classical roots and affixes, where the root or stem of the word isn't necessarily a freestanding word in its own right. Now, in that list of prefixes, I think it's around about 90 or so prefixes altogether, with the vast majority of them in level 5. I think that there should be systematic teaching, certainly from levels 2 to levels 4. And then I would then start to pick and choose a little bit at level 5, and perhaps get the learners making their own decisions about that, about how much to learn there. But I don't think I'd be going systematically through all of the affixes at level 5 and making sure that they were learned or known. Now, we've looked at the affixes. Let's look at word stems. So I was talking about bound forms, and here we have a bound form of the stem spec, which also can have several different forms. And for those who know Latin, which I don't, I'm told that some stems come from the it's the stem of the word, and then there's a past participle form, and the past participle form can also provide a different stem. So you've got spec, spec, scope, and they all mean look. And then in respect, the look in respect, the spect part of respect means to look up to with admiration, sorry. And once learners are on top of the most frequent prefixes and suffixes of English, I think it's worth having a look at some of the most frequent stems. Now you can see there's a lot of issues with these stems because there are many different forms of the stem and they can be fairly well hidden in some words. But what spec is probably the most frequent stem. One of my PhD students did a thesis on how many words in the first 2,000 words of English have related forms in the next 8,000 words of English. So that means from the third to the 10,000 words. And the one with the most words, I think, was spec. And this meant that if you knew the first 2,000 words of English, then you could say, well, I actually already know a word like respect with spec in it. How many other words, or what other words does that word occur in the third to the 10,000 words of English? And the idea of looking at this was to see how you could use knowledge of the first 2,000 words to make some of the next 8,000 words more accessible and more memorable for you. And she found, I think, that there was about another couple of thousand words from the third to the 10,000 which shared stems with words from the first 2,000. So that meant about a quarter of the words outside the first 2,000 up to the 10,000 could be learnt by going back to a word you already knew in the first 2,000 and using that as a kind of mnemonic device to help you remember the word. And what she did then was to say, well, then how would we re-express the meaning of a word like perspective, which contains spect, using the meaning of that stem, meaning to look. And so a perspective is a particular way of looking at things. And I thought that it would be really good if dictionary makers would actually include information on these stems as part of the etymology of words in learners' dictionaries. Some dictionaries have etymology, but when you look at it, it's either very complex or often very difficult to see some sort of connection. And it'll often say it goes back to French and then goes back to Italian, and it's really complicated. But it seems to me that if you came across a word like kaleidoscope, if there was then some indication that the word scope was a word that's related to a word you already knew from the first 2,000 words of English, that could be really helpful when looking up the dictionary to help that word stick in your memory. In the list of references which follow that talk, there's an article by Wei Zhang and I, which lists these most frequent stems and their frequency and all the examples of them and so on. And you can download that article free from my website. Okay, so we've looked at affixes and we've looked at stems. Now, let me pause there and see if there are any questions.
Paul, I just put into the chat that the American Heritage Dictionary has some etymological information, but it's not always the easiest to get through. I think, just like you said, I was just wondering, are there any dictionaries that you know of that have pretty good, easy to understand etymological information?
Yeah, I don't know of any, but then I haven't really been looking for it in dictionaries. At one point, the people from they keep changing their name. I think it was Heinley and Heinley, Cengage Learning, were considering putting this in a dictionary. And they said, oh, we'll give you some money and you can get a researcher to do all of these things and put it together. This was before my PhD student did the research. And I didn't really want to get too involved in that. So I sort of turned down the offer at the time. But later I tried contacting them after the PhD student had done the research as a way of perhaps giving her a bit of money. But they really didn't show any interest then. It was a pity. But I don't really know of any which sort of, the trouble is the etymological information aims to be accurate and historical and so on. Right. Whereas really what you want it to be in a learner's dictionary is to be pedagogical.
Pedagogical, yeah.
Yeah, so that the things that we say might not be 100% historically correct, but they're really going to help you learn the word, you know.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, any further questions? Otherwise, I'll just move on.
Yep, go ahead.
Go on. Okay, good. Okay. So we're really going back over those 6 points that I mentioned before and looking at how you might go about doing this thing of getting learners to develop morphological awareness. And the first thing was gain knowledge of the form and the meaning of word parts. And I think that word parts, I'm all in favor of rote learning. Rote learning is still denigrated and seen as being a bad thing, and everything's got to be communicative. But as you all know, I'm a firm, propagator of the 4 strands, and I think that about a quarter of the time in any language course should be spent on actually looking at language as language and doing deliberate study of features of language. So I've got no problem with rote learning because rote learning is highly efficient. And I would think that you could use a flashcard program or physical flashcards to learn the meaning of word parts. And if you learnt the 10 word parts, the level 3 word parts using flashcards, most Japanese learners would take about 10 or 15 minutes at the most to know those. And if you came back and did it, spent a couple of minutes in a couple of other classes, they'd be on top of the rote learning of those affixes in next to no time. So to me, it seems a very sensible thing to do. I also worked out an activity where learners could teach each other word parts. And it involved actually having one learner acting as a teacher and one learner acting as a learner. And the teacher had a list of word parts and their meaning and a couple of words which contained each of those parts. And so the teacher would see all that information on the sheet that they have in front. And then the learner acting as a learner would simply see a list of the meanings of the prefixes or suffixes. And so the teacher would then say a word and say something, let me see, say pause, composition. And then the learner would have to look through the list of meanings and to see what they thought the meaning of pause or post was. And so they got about 10 or 12 to look through, and they'd have a guess if they didn't know it. And if they thought they could figure it out, that's good. They'd give that meaning on their list. And then the teacher would give them 3 chances. And if they didn't pick the right meaning after 3 chances, the teacher would say, pause means put or to place. Okay, and then go on to another one, but not in order in which they occur on the sheet, because then it gets too easy. And then the main thing of the activity was, once the teacher had done one stem with the learner, then they'd do another one, and then they'd revise the previous one, and then go on to the next one, and then revise all of the 2 previous ones. And so the revision part was very important. And it took about 20 minutes for the learners then to be able to deal with all of those affixes on the sheet very quickly. And so the teacher would say pause, composition, and the learner would say put, because I'd already heard it, had a go at guessing it, what its meaning was from the list, and then had it repeated to them through the going back and doing the revision many times. It was quite a fun activity. And we checked out to see whether the teacher learnt as well as the students. And there was a lot of learning going on by the learners who were acting as the teachers. If this explanation is not so clear, don't worry. I think it's in that book, What Should Every EFL Teacher Know? But it's quite a fun way of getting learners working in pairs, teaching each other the affixes. And then the idea would be that in, say, next week's class, you'd come back and do it again. And then the teachers could switch roles with the people acting as learners, and they could act as learners and so on. And just through spending 2 20-minute sessions in class on that, you could get real good learning of those word parts. So I think deliberate learning of the forms and the meanings of word parts is something well worth doing. Okay. Learning to recognize word parts that change their spelling. Okay, and the activity here would be when you see the affix and so you're given the affix in the stem, and then you can try writing what it should be. So if you had something like in plus legal, then you would have to then rewrite that as illegal, ILLEGAL. And so that could be a sort of test come exercise for seeing the few affixes which change their forms when they're added to the stem, and the stem begins with a certain letter. Okay, and then you could have the reverse of that where you're separating the stem and the affix when seeing the whole word. So if they saw illegal, then they would cut between the double letters of L and then rewrite the IL as IN. And in the book that Laurie Bauer and I did, there's a I think chapter 3 is on the spelling rules which apply to morphological changes with the affix and stem. And it's a very short chapter because there's only about half a dozen or so spelling rules which apply. You might know some of those spelling rules yourself. You know, the Y becomes I and you add ES and those sorts of things. Okay. And here are some of the spelling rules here. So Y becomes I. So when happy plus ness, and then the learner would then have to say, well, how do you write happiness? And then the other way around, we just looked at is cut happiness into parts, and then you'd have to rewrite HAPPI as HAPPY and doing that. And then the doubling of consonants. The doubling of consonants and the next rule of final silent E is actually a couple of quite useful rules to learn together, because even though there's a lot of spelling irregularity in English, the rule of free forms and checked forms is a very useful rule to learners to get on top of, because it helps deal with a lot of spelling issues. And the reason why we double consonants when we add a suffix such as ing to swim is because the in swim is a short, or what they call a checked vowel. And if we add another vowel after the M, that vowel will influence the in swim and make it a free vowel, which is a long vowel, and it would be swimming instead of swimming. And so if we want to keep the pronunciation, we have to double that consonant so that the I in the ing doesn't affect the length of the I in swimming. And this is a rule which is well worth learning. I mean, how do you spell occurrence? Yeah, you've got occur, and then you've got the word occurrence. Do you double the L or not? And one of the ways to check whether you should double the R or not is to say, well, is the in the occurrence a free or a checked vowel? And it's very short, so it's clear it's a checked vowel. So therefore, you've got to have double R, E-N-C-E. And the rule then of final silent E is a rule worth learning, because it applies in a whole pile of ways in English, with complex words, but also with other words with English spelling. But there's not a lot of spelling rules, but it's useful to get on top of these ones which affect affixes. Okay. Learn to recognize parts in words. And this simply is a very useful activity, I think, of just cutting words into known parts, so that learners are given lists of words and they go through chopping them up into the parts that they can recognize. And they have to do this with a bit of thought in their head, thinking about what the word means and so on, because you can cut up words in all sorts of ways, but they're not very meaningful. But this very basic, I think, activity is a really important one, because it's very close to what learners have to do when they see a word in a text and they want to try and figure out if it relates to something that they already know or not. And so cutting words into parts I'd sort of include as part of intensive reading. This would be one of the exercises that I would do in intensive reading, of picking out some of the complex words in the text, getting the learners to chop them up into parts to see if they can recognize where the affixes are and what the stem is. Okay. And then we get to the essence of the word meaning strategy, the word part strategy, and that is see how the meaning of the parts relate to the meaning of the whole word. And I probably struggle a little bit with this one, with having activities which would be written type activities learners would do by themselves. But it's an activity that's probably best led, at least initially, by the teacher. And so when you come across a word which is a new word to you, and you then try and cut it into parts, and then figure out how the meaning of the parts relate to the whole, then something you can do then is sort of tagging the parts of a given meaning. And so what I've done here is to give the meaning of visible. So something visible is able to be seen. Now, what the learner would have to do would be then to say, okay, the able goes to able and the seen goes to vis. And so you might draw an arrow get the learner to draw an arrow from able to able and from seen to vis, to show that they can see how those aspects of the meaning of the word relate to the parts in the given word. So the teacher then would have to come up with some meanings given like that, and the learners just simply go through, underline the parts and relate them to the parts of the word. And so I've done another one for you here. When we separate things, we divide them into parts so that they can be moved away from each other. And so the part is connected to the PAR in separate. If you don't know how to spell separate, folks, and that's quite a commonly misspelled word, then if you know that it comes or is related to the word part, then you know that you don't spell it PER, but you spell it PAR, because that's related to the word part. And so once again, the learner might draw an arrow from parts in a circle around PAR, and then you would draw an arrow from away to SE, because SE one of the meanings of the prefix SE means away. Okay, and so that seems to me an exercise that I would do in class quite often. And whenever a new complex word came up to be dealt with in class, I would certainly make word part analysis part of dealing with that word. But word and part analysis is only going to make sense if the learners already know the meaning of the most useful prefixes and suffixes, and then if they know the meanings of some of the very common stems. And so this activity should be really building up on things that the learners have already studied and to largely already know. Now, recognize the members of a word family and their form meaning connections. I'm a little hesitant about this exercise because I've never really tried it in class, and I don't know whether it's just a time filler or whether it's an exercise which would have great value. Because I could see, if you gave the learners a whole pile of words and said, now these words can be sorted into 3 or 4 different families, or how many different families do you think they could be, then the learners then just sit around. They could do it by moving scraps of paper and so on, but I don't know how much it would be. If I was a learner doing it and I wanted to be like the typical learner and get the job done as quickly as possible and without thinking about it too much, I could see how you could do this sorting activity without thinking about it too much and solely on looking at form. So that's why I hesitate about it a little bit. But it seems to me that somewhere in the course, there's got to be some way of looking at word families and seeing how the members of the families are connected to each other and the common feature that they share, and how the differences between them come from their prefixes or suffixes, and that these differences are to some degree predictable from the meaning of the prefixes and suffixes and so on. So that's a receptive activity. Then we could have a productive activity. And once again, I sort of hesitate a bit on this one, and that is getting learners to recall family members. It's a bit like doing a semantic mapping activity where a stem goes up on the board and the learners start suggesting family members. I can sort of see how it could become an activity which is, the learners are bringing in things which are not really connected or so on. But anyway, I think that somehow we've got to figure out some kind of fairly straightforward activity which would help learners see that words can form families. Okay, and then gain control of the word part strategy. And so really the activities which have been done before this are really part of the strategy. It's just a matter of bringing them together and getting the learners to see that as a strategy. And so you'd sort of say, well, if you meet a word that you don't know and you look it up in the dictionary and you find out what it means and you want to make sure that it sticks in the memory, then if you can break it into parts, then you break it into parts, and then you try to relate the meaning of the whole word to the meaning of the parts. And an activity in class would be learners working in pairs, where each learner individually works on a word and says, yes, I think I can see these parts, and I've looked up the meaning, and yes, I can see how they relate. And then they explain the steps they went through to their partner, and their partner comments on how well they've applied the word part strategy. But it seems to me that because around about 60% of the vocabulary of English is from French, Latin, or Greek, and the vocabulary from French, Latin to Greek typically does have word parts, you can see that this could be a very frequently used strategy. Okay. Now, so morphological awareness, I think, fits into the language-focused learning strand because it involves deliberate attention to words, and it involves deliberate learning. And so I think it fits nicely into the language-focused learning strategy. Language-focused learning strand. How much time would you give it? Well, it's got to share time in the language-focused learning strand with the learning of deliberate study of grammar, the deliberate study of vocabulary, deliberate attention to features of reading. It sort of overlaps a bit with strategy development, but it's got to share time in the language-focused learning strand with strategy development. So developing morphological awareness then could be, let me say, so if the language-focused learning strand is about 1/4 of a course, then developing morphological awareness might be about 1/8 of the language-focused learning strand. So, 1/8 times 4 is 32. So 1/32 of the time in the course, perhaps towards morphological awareness. That'd probably give some rough idea of, it's something that you should regularly spend time on, but not enormous amounts of time. And I think the best way to make use of that time is then to be strategic in giving attention to the most useful prefixes and suffixes and stems and so on. Okay. Whoa, wow. We've got to the end. I'm a bit quick. So here are some references. Apple is dealing with morphological awareness for native speakers of English, and he's trying to bring together what researchers on morphology have been saying about learning, and it comes up with a it's an interesting article, but I think he doesn't cover all the aspects of morphological awareness that he could cover. And so if you compare Apple's list with the list of ideas and the kinds of learning that I gave at the beginning of this talk, you'll see that I've probably gone a little bit further than Apple in giving attention to that. The book that Laurie and I did, it was mainly written by Laurie. I wrote the chapter on pedagogy, and Laurie wrote all of the other chapters on morphology. I've been doing a little bit of work on morphology, trying to find out what are the words in the first 10,000 words of English. Let me think. First 3,000 words of English, which are the most common, and of the various affixes at level 3 and 4 and so on, and coming up with a list of those. It's quite interesting, actually, when you do look at those affixes, because you find that the most frequent derived forms of words take on a life of their own. And so probably the most striking example is the word business. And business actually comes from busy plus ness. But there's no way now that native speakers even think of that when they use the word business. And I think business is probably more frequent than busy. And so busy has now, I think they call it lexical drift or semantic drift. And what's happened is when you have a very, very frequent derived form, which is much more frequent than the stem, that word starts to take on a life of its own. And there are words like the word actually is another one, for example. Actually is much more frequent than the word actual. But actually, in a way, is starting to separate itself from actual in some ways, because it's now used as more with a kind of discourse function rather than meaning, going back to the meaning of the stem actual, although there is clearly a connection there. But this sort of lexical drift really only applies to the really, really frequent, relatively frequent derived forms of words. And I don't think there are that many, certainly in the first 2,000 or 3,000 words. I think at the most we'd probably be talking about less than 10 words where it wouldn't really make a lot of sense to go back and look at to say, well, this is a stem form with ly on the end, or it's a stem form with tion on the end, and so on, because it's still only a very small number of words. The Bauer and Nation article 1993 is the one that we worked on quite a long time ago, and that was the first step towards making the BNC COCA lists, because it was clear to me that unless we had some clear criterion for deciding what could be a member of a word family, it wasn't possible to make systematic word lists of English. And so that article was actually a really important one for me, because it then allowed me to go on and be systematic in making level 6 of those BNC COCA lists. We've also made lists at the level 3 partial, it's called, which is just halfway through level 3. I think it only makes sense to make lemma lists or lists at level 3, say, for the first 2,000 or 3,000 words of English. And there's not much point going much further, because you would certainly hope that learners who knew more than the first 3,000 words of English should be able to cope with a wider range of prefixes and suffixes. And then there's the article Brown and Stokels with McLean and Stewart, which is a really interesting article arguing for a reduced sized word family at least for Japanese learners of English. And the Learning Vocab in Another Language has a chapter on word parts. At the moment, my thing that's occupying quite a lot of my time is I'm now writing the 3rd edition of that book. I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and it'll be finished before the end of the year. And it reminded me of Spike Milligan. He wrote, he was an English comedian, and he wrote a book called Pacoon. And then he wrote another book, and at the introduction to that book, he said something like this. He said, "When I wrote Pacoon, I swore I would never write another book. Here it is." And I feel the same way about learning vocabulary in another language. When I'd finished doing the second edition, there was so much new research on vocabulary that I had great difficulty getting my head around it all and being able to try and bring it together. And I'm not sure I did it that successfully. But in those days, I was reading hard copy. And so I was reading photocopies of all the articles which had appeared about vocabulary since the first edition of the book, which was about 12 years. And the pile of articles I was reading came up to my knee, and they were printed on both sides. And so I had to read all of that sort of stuff and then try and get it some organized way and try and relate it to the ideas in the book. The third edition has the same issue. There's been an enormous amount of new research on vocabulary. And for one person to try and get their head around it is becoming more and more difficult, because there are so many new areas of research, and you've got to read this stuff as critically as you can as well. So it's quite a big job. So I'm not sure I'll ever see a fourth edition of the book. I hope I can see the third edition. And then the last one on the list of references is the article I mentioned by Wei Zhang, and that's on the word part technique. This is a very simple, straightforward article, and you can get it free from my resources page. The university has restructured its digital offerings, and so everything which used to be available from my website is no longer available from my website. And so if you want to find any of my publications which are freely available, and word lists and all that sort of stuff, you now have to type Paul Nation Resources, and then that'll take you to where they are. I'll work on trying to improve access to it, but I've got a feeling that the restructuring has made it a little bit more difficult to find those things.
I just actually put up, Paul, I just put a link in the chat directly to your resources page.
Oh, good. Okay, that's great. Okay, I think that's about it. So I'm prepared to try and handle any questions now.
All right, so if you'd like to just open up your mics, you are free to chat with Paul.
Paul, the most important question is, are we going to even be able to lift edition 3? Because I remember Teaching and Learning Vocabulary by Heinle and Heinle was a nice thin book, and each subsequent edition is getting thicker and thicker. I think it's going to be like an exercise in weightlifting for your third edition.
No. But in fact, one chapter, I think it's about the same, going to be the same word length as the second edition. And the chapter on dictionaries is going to be taken out, and perhaps the critical essence of that will be added to some other chapter. And then there'll be a new chapter on extramural vocabulary learning, so learning vocabulary outside of the classroom, because there's a growing area of research on that, which sort of indicates that certainly in Europe, kids beginning their English lessons already know a lot of English before they actually start English lessons, that they've picked up through playing games and being on the internet and getting involved in social networks and so on. So I'm trying to do a shortish chapter on that, but it's not going to grow, Charlie. It'll be that size. I should say that for the first edition, the book that was offered to the publishers was about 50% longer than what they actually published. They said, you can't publish all the stuff, it's too long. So I had to cut out about 4 or 5 chapters. Probably a good idea too.
Much appreciated, from all of us.
I see Dorothy has her hand up. So Dorothy, if you want to go ahead and ask a question, that's great.
Hi, sorry for not having my camera on, but it's pretty late where I am. I was wondering how often do you update word lists, and how do you go about that? Like the academic word list and the general service list, how do those updates, how often do they occur, and how do you do those?
Oh yeah. Well, the only word lists that I update now are the BNC COCA word lists. I leave the academic word list is really Ave Coxhead's research, and so I leave that to her. But I put a lot of work into the BNC COCA word lists, and the first 2,000 words particularly. I sort of believe that when you make word lists for language teaching, you can use frequency and range as criteria, but I think you also have to apply quite a bit of individual judgment to the list. And that individual judgment involves, for example, making sure that all the numbers are there, or making sure that all of the months of the year are there. And even though I'm not greatly in favor of learning in lexical sets, I think it's a bit funny if you have, say, number 17 missing because it happens to be very low frequency, or you don't have November because nobody wants to talk about November, or something like that. And so you do have to apply a lot of judgment. And so
I'm going to turn the camera on.
Oh, sorry, who's this? Have I turned the camera off? No.
No,
Okay.
sorry. Yeah,
I'm
no,
okay. Okay.
you're-
And so I'm actually updating the word list quite a lot. In many ways, it's like a black hole. I would hate to think how many hundreds of hours of time I've put into those word lists. But in fact, it's probably not wrong to say that probably every month I would make some change, but I don't post the changed word lists on my website until there's a reasonable amount of changing and checking. And so I probably update them on the website about once every couple of years. Otherwise, I think I'm just going to really annoy people. And Lawrence Anthony has convinced me that I should be giving, how would you say, applying a reference number to the word list, saying this is word list, BNC COCA word list version, version 2.3.1, and in fact, if you go onto my website and look at the information sheet that accompanies the word lists, you'll find that there is some explanation of how the word lists are going to be numbered in the future. And so, version 4.3.1 means if you change 0.1 to 0.2, it probably means you've changed about 4 or 5 words or corrected some minor errors. Whereas if it was version 4.4.1, then that change from 3 to 4 might indicate that you've made a bit more substantial change, such as moving words from 1,000 level to another 1,000 level, and so on. I don't want to get too hung up on it, because I think that word lists are a sort of, they're useful for research, and they're very useful for guiding teaching and so on. But where words occur in the word list is strongly dependent on the corpora that you use to get the frequency and range information for the words. And using a different corpus is likely to change what could be in a list. There's research by was it Brezina and Gablisova and so on, where they made several word lists from using a range of corpora, I think it was, and they found about something like an 80% overlap between the different lists. Well, they thought that was quite a good overlap. I don't think it's a very good overlap, because it means 1 in 5 words, 1 out of every 5 words is a different word in your word list. I think that if you control the corpora that you deal with, so that you make word lists on very similar corpora, then you'll get a much closer overlap, much more overlap between the words on list. And one of my PhD students, Joseph Sorrell, actually looked at that and found that the spoken written distinction was critically important when looking at corpora and comparing and so on. And so that's why with the first 2,000 words, I've done a lot of work looking at them in spoken corpora and looking them in written corpora and so on like that. And so I'm quite happy now that my first 2,000 words are about as good as you're likely to get when you're trying to make, say, a replacement for the general service list and so on. But I still think it's, the word lists are influenced by corpora, and there's, I think, personal judgment needs to be involved. And so so there are changes occurring, but I wouldn't get too fussed about them. Learners don't necessarily learn exactly as things are in the word lists, and there's a lot of, there's a lot of things which come in between that. So I'd take them seriously enough, but I wouldn't say, oh, this word's in 3,000, not in the second, and so therefore not worth learning at this point or so on. I'd sort of be a little bit more flexible, probably.
Great. Okay, thanks, Paul. We now have a question from Susie Fukuda in Tokyo.
Sorry, before we get to Susie's question, Paul, do you mind if I stop your sharing of screen so everyone can see you and see the people asking questions better?
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to see the uncertainty in my eyes, is that
right? Or up close.
Okay, sorry, Susie, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry I'm not using my photo either. I was just wondering if you had the full reference or if it's out yet of that study you talked about in the beginning with the frequency of the word versus the word stem frequency in the derived form. You saw it was like
the derived form and the stem form.
Right. The one that you said you just came across this week.
Yeah, it's not a publication. I'm just working on it at the moment. So I just went through the first 1,000 words about a couple of weeks ago, actually, and carefully I ran them through. I've developed my own sort of corpus, and which is 50% spoken and 50% written, about 10 million words. Mm-hmm. And then I ran my word lists through that, and you can, when you use, I'm hesitant to say the range program because I'm the only person in the world who uses it and who should use it, and everyone else should use Ant Word Profiler. But you can actually update the word list to put frequency figures next to the items in the word list. And so I went through the word list looking for those words which had a derived form which was more frequent than the frequency of the lemma.
Okay.
Then having done that, I then realized I've got to go through and do it again, although I've got to check on each one of those and then actually put the frequency of the lemma and the frequency of the derived form and look at their relative frequency.
Right.
And because I have a feeling, I think I've got about, I worked out that, now what was the rule of thumb? Yeah, for each letter of the alphabet, there was roughly one word where the derived form was more frequent than the stem form. So I had about 30 words, but I've got a feeling that when I go through and look at relative frequency, say, for example, where the derived form is at least 50 or twice as frequent as the stem form, then I'll end up with a shorter list, but I still think it'll be about 20 words or so in the first 1,000.
Okay, no, it was just really interesting finding.
And what I'm happy to do is I'm happy to either, you could send me an email in about a month, and I should have it done, or I can pop it up on my website.
Okay,
but it just struck me it's quite interesting then to look at that and see is there lexical drift amongst those words or not. It seems to me quite. And whether it would be useful to use those words with learners to then say, like I wouldn't use business as a way of introducing learners to the suffix ness.
Right.
But whereas I'd probably use happiness or sadness, or no, I wouldn't use sadness. I'd use happiness to introduce people to ness, and so on.
Okay, great, thanks.
Great, thank you. And next, Francesco in Nara. You have a question for Paul.
Yeah, hi, thanks. And great to catch up with you, Paul, and always Brings back memories of my MA and good memories. I'm, as you know, I'm working at a medical university at the moment, so it's quite a specific question. When you're teaching medical students, I teach after the first year. Once we've got through the academic vocabulary list, we move into medical vocabulary. And one of the problems with medical vocabulary is that it's all incredibly specialized. And so it's very hard to predict what area of medicine a second year student is going to end up in 10 years time. How much time would you recommend spending on morphology and teaching them, which is heavy in medicine, more heavy than normal language, you know?
Yeah.
What advice do you have about that?
I'd probably, let me say, well, I think you're right about the morphology. I think one of our PhD students did a study of the technical vocabulary of medicine. Her name was Betsy Quero, Quero. And so you could probably look at her PhD thesis on that. But she worked out that there were probably at least 10,000 technical terms of medicine which were well outside the mid-frequency words of English, I think. And so if you're learning to be a doctor, you're actually having to learn a hell of a lot of vocabulary. But quite a lot of that vocabulary did have medical prefixes and suffixes and so on. And so I would think it'd be a really important thing. I'm sure, well, I would think there could be some research where people have tried to work out what are the frequent prefixes and suffixes and stems of medicine. And although when I say that there should be research, I doubt if it's been done very systematically. It's probably somebody just sitting down and thinking of, you know, cardio and I don't know, I don't want to get into that and all that sort of stuff, and thinking about that and then listing it down. But it would be useful to see if there was some. I think it wouldn't be too hard to do a sort of frequency-based study on medical vocabulary, because I think Betsy does have word lists of the technical vocabulary, and it wouldn't be too hard to run those, you know, to sort them or to do searches to find out the frequency of various things. But it could just be that, but I think actually that morphological awareness is probably critical for people studying medicine, and that would include native speakers as well, because native speakers, you know, coming to learn medicine have a hell of a lot of vocabulary to learn. And I would think that the vocabulary size of doctors is probably like the vocabulary size of botanists and zoologists, which would put them about 10,000 words more than the average native speaker, you know. So I think it's very important. Yeah.
So just going in with those lists and trying to run data analysis on those to find the most important ones would be.
Yeah. It'd be useful. It'd be interesting to see if you could do it without doing too much work. I think it'd be a useful thing to do. And I think now that there are lists of medical vocabulary, and, you know, we have good search programs and so on like that, it would be, I think the idea would be to use frequency in the way that Laurie Bauer used it in that article, where to say frequency means how many different words does a stem occur in. Then that would be the way to do it. But, you know, any sort of person now, I suppose, is developing their morphological, you know, when you can go on the internet and look up all your illnesses and do a bit of self-diagnosis and so on, you start to develop a bit of morphological awareness in medicine yourself and things. But it seemed to me that, you know, if you could then come up and say, well, it'll be like the Zipfian curve, in that you'll have a small number of really frequent affixes, and then you'll have a large number of less frequent affixes. And I'm sure they'll follow, you know, that Zipfian curve of very high, small number, very high frequency, which then levels out to be lots of ones of low frequency and so on. and then getting on top of the high frequency ones would be really useful. But I think that your medical student should have the word part strategy, morphological awareness and awareness words break into parts, that relating the meaning of the parts to the meaning of the whole is a good way to remember it. And those basic ideas that I listed early on, I think that's very important for medicine. Critical, I would say. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. If you have, I could help you contact Betsy Ketto for the list, and you could just do it. I think it's a list of word types. I think she decided, like Teresa Chung decided, that when you do technical vocabulary, the word family is not the most suitable unit of counting, because different members of not all the family members are necessarily technical words.
Wow.
So I think she used word types. Yeah.
Okay.
Great. Thank you for the question. Next, we have Dom Jones in Sendai. Go ahead, Dom.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Paul. Very interesting. I had flashbacks from my geology studies, because we used to do geomorphology, the shapes of land.
Oh, yeah.
So it was interesting. The shapes of words, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It reminds me of phonetics is a good way of teaching beginner students how to pronounce words. And then this morphological awareness seems to be good for more advanced students. In the Japanese situation, would you be able to kind of pinpoint it at a time when that morphological awareness should come in? For example, I mean, if we could use like a TOEIC score or an Aiken test score, which a lot of Japanese students are familiar with.
I think that you have so many words, even in the first 2000, which are complex words, that it's probably worth starting it quite early. So I can't really work from the Japanese levels you mentioned, but if I work, say, from word frequency levels, I would say that certainly when you're into the second 1,000 words, I'd be certainly giving attention to derivational morphology. Now, inflectional morphology, you've got to give attention to right early on, but singular, plural, and past tense, present tense, and things like that. But it seems that this isn't always a great issue, and Japanese learners seem to get on top of that quite readily. But I would think that, but even LY and things like that, LY and NES and ER, teacher, singer, dancer, these sorts of things. These are very frequent affixes which occur with words in the first 1,000. So I wouldn't delay it. I would sort of get there. I don't see that morphological awareness would be a big step for Japanese learners, because Japanese has complex words as well. I hope I'm right. You have word parts and derived forms and things like that. So it's not a big jump at all. Yeah. So I'd certainly get onto it early. And one of the reasons is going back to that thing about repetition. If you can see that related forms are related, then you double or triple the potential repetitions you get of words.
Thank you very much.
And I see we have a new question from Alex M. in Niagara Falls, Canada.
Oh.
Well, it's not a question. It's just a follow-up on the comment that it's not a big jump. I used to teach in Japan, but I still teach many East Asian students, and I call prefixes and suffixes our kanji, and I make that link to basically er and im and in and things like that, so that I might have an East Asian student come and put up the Chinese character for transport, and beside it put the character for person, and to the left of that put the character for in or out. And just the comment you made, it's not a big jump. I agree entirely. And I think that in essence, affixes are our kanji.
Yeah. Well, it's always interesting when you look at morphology, I see the connection between that and multi-word units, for example, collocation and that sort of thing. It seems to me it's the same sort of thing happening, that you have words coming together and often creating a slightly different meaning, but there's only a very small number of multi-word units in English where the meaning of the parts don't contribute in some way to the meaning of the whole. Our calculation from another one of our PhD students, Lynn Grant, is that there's probably less than 100 multi-word units in English where the meaning of the parts seem to bear no connection to the meaning of the whole. And what that means is that the history of that multi-word unit has been lost. And one example is cats and dogs in the phrase raining cats and dogs. You know, people have got ideas, you know, about dead dogs were thrown up onto the roof and dead cats were thrown up onto the roof, and when it rained, they got washed down. That's purely fanciful, you know. It's okay to help you remember it if you want to remember it, but there's no sort of etymological evidence for that at all. But there's only about less than 100 of those where the parts don't in some way contribute to the meaning of the whole. Now, it could be that they're like, you know, with lexical drift, when you have a multi-word unit which is very frequent, then it starts to take on a bit of a life of its own and start to move away from the meaning of the parts to some degree. But there's usually some basic connection there. Yeah, but I think the way of relating to kanji is quite good. You should have a look. Have you heard of the keyword technique, Alex?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, because in my classes, I used to compare the keyword technique to the, oh gosh, this is terrible. What's the name of that guy? Heisig, is it, in Japan, who sort of analyzes a kanji and uses the parts of the kanji as a way of remembering them. And we used to analyze that technique for learning Japanese kanji and compare it to keyword. And what you're doing seems to me in a way very similar to the keyword technique. Oh yeah, that'll be it. Yep. Thanks, Francis. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions for Paul at this moment?
Yeah.
No.
Rob has his hand up.
Rob has his hand. He's an analog hand. Great, Rob. Go ahead.
Yeah, I put my hand up, so I did. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we've been having hands up on the Zoom thing. So okay. I've been looking there, not at actual people.
You talked a lot about the frequency of word parts and affixes based on frequency from corpora. What about the learnability? I think that's a crucial factor in teaching order. You know, the ones which are going to be learned quicker obviously might make sense to be taught quicker. Have you been reading up about that?
Well, I've got thoughts about that, because with the making of word lists, there are sort of arguments about, you know, do we use a frequency-based word list or do we use a difficulty-based word list? And difficulty is usually used to mean have learners got it correct or not in some sort of test or some measure like that. And so that's not really a measure of difficulty. It's necessarily, I'm sure there are other factors besides, say, intrinsic difficulty entering into that. But I think these are two different things. And I go back then to curriculum design, and Hutchinson and Waters, when doing needs analysis, said, you know, when you're looking at needs, you're trying to design a course, and you say, well, what do we put into the course? Then you can do needs analysis to say what goes into the course. And they distinguish what they call lacks, necessities, and wants. And lacks were based on what learners knew and what they didn't know. So lacks is not a good term because it can be a positive thing. It means the things you know and the things you don't know, and so on. And so I think difficulty fits, you know, or learner knowledge of items fits into that category. And then you have needs, and needs really says, if you use the language, what is important? which is irrelevant about whether it's difficult or easy or whatever. You know, you can't say, well, that is difficult, so we're not going to learn it or leave it till later, or, you know, a high frequency word. You've just got to learn it because it's going to occur so often. And then once is just what the learners felt that they really needed to satisfy their needs a lot. And so I see needs, necessities as relating to frequency of occurrence. And I think if you're designing your course so that the learners get the best return for learning effort, then I think you've got to use something like frequency and range or something as a measure of usefulness. But I think that having then decided what you're going to include in your course on the basis of usefulness, you can then say, well, there are some things that we might not have to give too much attention to because they're already likely to be known. And that's where that difficulty or learner knowledge comes in. So I think Charlie, with the with Guy Sickles thing, you were collecting data on, you know, whether learners, how many learners knew it, and that sort of thing. And I think Norbert's been doing work on that as well. So I don't see them as competitors. I see them as things which have to be brought together, because I don't see any point in saying, well, these things are going to be easy, so we learn them first, if they're not really useful to learn, you know. So you've got to look at...
The reason I brought that up was because one of my students did some research in this, and you'd mentioned that level 6, RE, was a very hard one to work on, and that was the number one that all the students knew.
Yeah, but the I looked that up too, because once again, if you look it up in the book that Laurie did and in the notes to the article, the 1993 article, you'll see that RE has quite a lot of, it can mean back, it can mean again, and there are many words beginning with RE where it's not really the affix at all, and so it's not. So it's actually very frequent, but it's also not always transparent and not always acting as you would hope that it would act, you know.
So there's a balance between generativity and frequency there, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. I would guess that for receptive purposes, you might say, okay, yeah, well, RE is going to be useful and so on, and do that because it's so frequent. But it's certainly not a straightforward affix. And I think Laurie's got quite good notes on it in that article and in the book as well. So if you read up on that, you could see some of the difficulties associated with it. Yeah.
And just to follow up, this is Charlie here. With difficulty, what we were doing, and this was mostly Brent Culligan's work, his PhD, was difficulty as being population specific. So we were, you know, the original data was looking at the difficulty of words for the Japanese population, but we were finding that every single different EFL population, the difficulties were quite different. So that's another factor to think about.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but I think it's important not to see them as competitors, but to see them, because I'm still a frequency range type of man, I guess. But I just say that, you know, if you're going to learn a language, you might as well learn the most useful things. And if some of those are really easy, great. But some of them are going to be difficult, and you still got to learn them, I'm afraid, because they're so important, you know. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Charlie. Okay, Alex in Sendai has a question.
Yes, easy or difficult, Alex?
I'll try to make it easy. I'll try.
Yeah, good. We're getting to the time of the evening when ease and difficulty become important.
All right, I'll try to be concise and let you answer concisely. So I was just thinking about some of the activities that you suggested and whether I would have found them useful even as like a native English speaker when I was growing up in school or something. And I don't think we really did much of them. I don't think many of the people here as native speakers did much. We learned most of it through implicit reading or from watching movies from people more knowledgeable than ourselves. And it's just like, that seems kind of proven to work to me. So why should we focus so more on these explicit activities? I'm willing to try it, but I'm just wondering why we wouldn't ask our students to just have a lot of input the way we had it ourselves.
Well, the first reason is that deliberate learning is far more effective in the short term. Oh, no. Forget about in the short term, folks. Deliberate learning is far more quickly effective than incidental learning. And I think that when you have really frequent and useful things that the learners would benefit from knowing, then you've got to get some deliberate effort towards it, because the effort to learn, say, 20 prefixes, all of the level 3 and 4 prefixes and suffixes, seems to me minimal effort, really. But anyway, you might spend a total of an hour over 4 or 5 months on it, and the payoff is so great. I also remember my learning at secondary school, learning of grammar. We learnt reported speech and we learnt about relative clauses. It was a waste of time. And if they had got in and taught us about prefixes and suffixes, that would have been a whole new ball game as far as I was concerned. Because, when I started, looking at prefixes and suffixes and word building, it's really quite exciting. You start, the word separate, it never occurred to me that separate contained the word part, or the same stem as in part. And once I figured that out, then I thought, well, now I know how to spell separate and so on like that. And there was so much value in it. And it would build on knowledge that to some degree we already had, but it would just, how would you say, regularize and focus that particular knowledge. So I think the gains are a lot, but I think we still, the reason I'm a bit hesitant about the exercises is that some of them I haven't tried myself in class. I hope that one of my colleagues here is going to write an app which will help teach the high frequency affixes. I think that the colleague is engaged upon it already. And I'm all in support of that, because I think that it'd be really suited to sort of computer-based learning, and with spending just a few minutes each day on it, you could really learn a lot, which would make vocab learning much easier. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that wasn't too difficult, Alex. Thanks.
All right. Well, we're gonna probably have a little bit more challenging question for you next. Stuart McLean has.
Oh no, I can get rid of Stuart easily. Yeah.
Go ahead, Stuart.
Hello, Paul. Thanks for the.
Hi.
I imagine Norbert and also Jeffrey Pinchbeck are fully in agreement that when selecting words to be learned, frequency is probably the most important thing.
Yeah.
However, Norbert and Jeffrey, and increasingly myself, and I originally had the opposite view, is that if we're profiling texts, and if we're measuring lexical knowledge to match students with materials, there's great value in using knowledge-based lists.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. But I would also say that there are other reasons for profiling text too, and you've been cautious by saying, when you profile text for matching with particular students. But you can also profile text to see which words are going to give you the greatest benefit for learning, and so on. And then that I think would require different lists. Yeah. In fact, it'd be quite interesting to run two analyses or simultaneous analyses of a text. The words using both frequency and difficulty. So you could then look at a text and say, these are really important and these ones are going to be already known, and just see, it would be useful information. But I'm in agreement with that.
I've done something similar. Jeffrey Pinchbeck created a knowledge-based list for Japanese learners. You can access it on New Word Level Checker, created by Mizumoto Sensei. And the frequencies you get are very different. Well, the profiles you get are very different.
Yeah, that's right. The user, when you analyze texts, you're using word lists. And I know from making word lists that making word lists is a how'd you say, it's a fraught exercise. You've got to use judgment. You've got to create a corpus which makes sense, and you can never create a corpus which fully makes sense, simply because you know, say for young kids, you can't get material for young kids very easily and so on, and you've got to go with the best you can get. But then you realize that your lists, you know, are corpus related and so on, and then you analyze texts, and anyone analyzing texts who's done any amount of it knows that you've got to analyze them first, and then go back and make adjustments to your lists, and then analyze them again, and perhaps make adjustment even to the text, and analyze again before you come up with some sort of sensible analysis. And so these are all fairly blunt instruments, and so I think it's good to do such analysis. I think you learn a lot from it, and it can be helpful for learners, but you can only take it to a certain degree of seriousness, you know. Yep. Okay.
Great. Thank you. All right. I'm afraid this is very close to the time that we have committed from Paul.
Oh, Catherine's been waiting patiently. I think she's
Catherine. Oh, Catherine. Okay. Well, let's have Catherine, and then we'll
yeah.
We have a couple of other things to do first before we let you go.
Last question to Catherine.
Okay. Last question, Catherine.
Okay. No, I don't have a question. Hughes just was talking so much. I was reminded of this little book that I have myself bought many. I think I'm dating myself by if anybody else recognizes this series.
Is that for learning Japanese?
It's for learning Japanese. Yes, it's instant vocabulary. So I was just remind because you referenced learning Japanese several times, and indeed this is one of the tools that. I would throw that out there. That's all. It wasn't a question at all. So thank you so much for an excellent talk.
Nice. Oh, that's good. That was a short question. So Harumi, you should get in with your final question.
Harumi's actually after Ken. We have Ken and then Harumi. We've got a little.
Oh, okay.
So I'm going to turn it over to Ken now, and Ken, you are up.
Okay. Paul, thanks so much for your talk today, and for all that you've contributed us over the years. And we just thought we'd send you a little thank you card here for all that you've done for us at Sendai. I'm going to share my screen for a second here.
When I saw Ken once, I wondered why I knew him so well. And then I realized that we'd been at the onsen seminar together. And so we shared a was it ofuro, is it?
That's right.
Then I realized why I knew him so well.
That's right. Intimate knowledge.
Yeah.
Can everybody see this? Is that okay?
Yep,
oh yes. Oh gosh.
I'm just going to go through this, Paul. Pollination has been an important part of the JALT Sendai community since 2007.
Yeah.
And he's presented for us 5 times. And if you count each time he's been up here, it's much more than that if we separated all of those presentations. And he's discussed various aspects of language learning and teaching with us. And he's done weekend workshops at the onsen. He's done special lectures for us. And he's attended our presentations as well, not only spoken to us, but heard what we had to say. We've bathed together, as Paul mentioned.
That was called the Get Naked with Pollination weekend.
That's right.
There's about 300 people on the waiting list, wasn't there?
We've drunk together.
Oh yes, I remember that.
Yeah, it was a nice evening, and enjoyed so many conversations together. Paul's visits have also brought our community together in many ways. Your visits have been occasion for so many of us to gather and to meet and to discuss and grow together. And Paul will always appreciate what you've done for and with us. And with warmest, enduring regards from all of us at JALT Sendai. Thank you, Paul, very much.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm really so. Sendai always has a very soft spot in my heart, and so even nowadays when I try and say no to most invitations, I find I can't say no to Sendai.
we were thrilled you agreed to do this, Paul, and thanks so much for another time together. We really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Ken.
Okay.
All right, and now we have Harumi.
Oh.
Thanks, Ken.
This is not a question. I just beginning to think that what listening to your talk about word parts, then the boundary between words and multi-word expressions, I began to think that their line is quite thin. Words are made up of stem and affixes, right?
Yeah.
And then also multi-word expressions, usually they have one stem or keyword and then some other smaller parts join.
Yeah.
Not all, but then what is the difference between the words and multi-word expressions? Words are separated by space, yes, but
yeah, well, in some ways it's probably tradition, because you could argue that in some languages they might what would be an affix in English is treated as a word in another language, and so I think you probably, what lies behind your comment is probably correct in that I see many similarities in the way I see frequency distribution similarities. I see the way you go about learning similarities in that. I see sort of the way in which lexical drift occurring in both of those sorts of things. I just see it all as being related. And I also see as what people call polysemy as being related to that as well. I'm not a great believer in polysemy. Once again, a PhD student of mine sort of convinced me that polysemy is probably more an artifact of analysis rather than something which is psychologically real. But I see the same sort of thing occurring where words have different senses, and some senses are more frequent and they merge into each other and there are common features. I see it probably at all these different levels of language, that there are similar principles, difficulties and sort of things operating. And so once you look at it like that, then there are certain principles of learning and of analysis and so on, which I think apply to all of those different levels. So I think your comment is spot on there. Okay. Yep.
Thank you for sharing your ideas.
Good.
Thank you. And Harumi, did you have an announcement?
Yes. Can I share my screen?
Yeah,
this is about the next event.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is our next JALT Sendai event.
Can you see that? Okay.
Oh, good.
This is not the final flyer, but next month we are inviting Kip Cates, and he's working on teaching and learning languages through global issues. So if you are interested, please come again next month. Thank you. That's it.
And I can certainly recommend Kip. I've known him over the years and been to various seminars he's organized and heard him speak, and it's really interesting.
Okay, thank you.
Harumi, can I also point out, you have on the bottom of the poster, we're going to be doing a raffle of Jose Cruz's new book.
Go ahead, Mark Sensei, go ahead.
Anyway, Jose is here. You can ask him about it at the break. But anyway, he has a new book on teaching on Zoom, and I recommend it. Just finished reading it this week. And anyway, we're going to be raffling a copy to somebody in the audience next month.
Yay.
It's our door prize for someone who attends. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Okay. So we're going to take a bit of a break, but
Corey.
We've got a couple of.
Do you want to have Allison? I mean, we got a couple other events coming up.
Hang on. I was just going to mention that Paul probably needs to take a bit of a break. And Paul, are you able to join us in about 10-15 minutes for a quick compai?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So the next stuff is related really to our attendees, and Paul, if you'd like to stay, that's great. But if you'd also like to take a bit of a break, it's 4:55 now. So at 5:10 we will meet back here for a compai, and so either stay or take a break, Paul. And thank you very much for the first part of the session and all the questions afterwards. This has been great. And now I know that Allison has an announcement about our Young Learners event coming up, and also Steve has a couple of other announcements. So Allison, would you like to let us know about the Young Learner event?
Yes, in the chat I've put the details, and this is a pre-Olympic event. Whether the Olympics go ahead or not, we're doing our pre-Olympic event, and you're very welcome to join us. We have Sandy from Portugal and David from Norway talking about how we can use children's literature in our classes. Anything to add, Emily?
Oh, I just shared the poster in the chat. If people want to look at that, we haven't set up the registration yet. So if you're interested in the event, keep an eye on the website, and we'll get registration set up for that soon.
Thank you. Looking forward to seeing lots of people there.
Great, thank you. Steve, did you have anything else to add beyond the next couple of events?
So in August, I think Ken's planning an event about language journeys. So various folks who've learned foreign languages as part of the careers that we've run into over the course of the years will be presenting. So former students. So Ken, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, but I think we're still working on the date for it.
Great, thank you, Steve. And as I mentioned at the beginning of Paul's presentation, he will be presenting as our plenary at the Extensive Reading Around the World 2021 conference in August. And I see that Paul has put the, Rob Waring has put the information on our event, and I've also just posted it there. So if you'd like to join us, as I mentioned, the attendance fee for the entire weekend conference is $20 US in developed countries and $5 US in developing countries. So please feel free to join us. So I would like to take a 10-minute break, and at 5:10 we will come back. You're all welcome to come back. We're going to have a social event. It is the beginning of the evening here in Sendai for us. So if you'd like to join us in a few minutes, we'd love to have you back. So Emily, if you can put on a bit of music for the moment, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and we'll see everyone back here for a kampai at 5:10.